I've always thought that watercolor is more akin to pottery than it is to any other kind of painting. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Alright, my comparison with watercolor and pottery begins right here at the palette, because the wetness of the paint determines so much about what's going to happen next. So if you have the paint, as you see, I had water in the brush, and then I reached over and pulled paint into the water that was in the brush and left it here. You see here you have a very wet pile of paint. Now, if I move over to the paper and I apply that a bit of that paint here, you can see then that this is the color you get. The wetness of the paint will determine the value of the color. If I pull more of that color and less water, and here I'm going to blot the brush. Let me pick this up right here. And I'm just going to blot the water from the brush right here where the bristles join the metal. Just like that. So less paint, or less water and more paint will give a darker color. There you are. And rinsing the brush out a bit, pulling the majority of the water out of the brush, I go to the edge of my pile of paint, picking up a little bit more water, and I have here an even lighter color. Now this is where it begins, where we're able to, when we're first introducing ourselves to watercolor, we're able to control the value of our colors by the amount of water that goes into it. But that's not all there is to it. There's a lot more. So it's a good idea, if you're a watercolor painter, to have something available that will absorb water really good. I like these baby diapers. They're just wonderful, and when you get them all saturated with paint and stuff like that, you can throw them into the washer, and then you've got your pad all ready again. So they're cloth baby diapers. I think those are probably still available. The disposable baby diapers work really well too. But anyway, so I always like to have my pad right beside my palette, like that, so that I can control the water. Now, that will allow me then, when I wet the brush, it will allow me to take the wet brush to the pad to pull out the excess water. And then that will enable me to more easily control the amount of water that goes into mixing paint. Okay, let's go to the next part. The next part is the wetness of the paper. Now, if you're painting wet on dry, as we were here in this little portion, you don't have to worry so much about that. But what makes watercolor so wonderful is that it has all these things it can do with its various wetnesses. So that's what I want to show next, and that is, if we come to the paper and we wet it, and you can do this with a brush or with a spray bottle, but we wet, you could wet the whole paper or just a section of it, but I want to show this wetting just the surface of it. Now, what we need to be doing here is having our eye so acutely glued to that section that we wet that that's all we see, because we are looking for gloss. And what we're going to notice, I'm going to pull this up just a little bit like this, what we're going to, hoping by rocking it around a little bit, you can see the gloss. When it's at high gloss, the paint, especially if it's somewhat wet in the brush, the paint is going to spread around. It's going to go places when we have a high gloss. You see how it bleeds? It's going to go places, and we can actually push the paint by adding more water to it. So you see, if we add more water like that, then when the paint begins to travel. So we can get all kinds of loose effects just by the way we allow the water and the paint to work together, where the paint itself or the water itself is causing the paint to flow. Now that's really wet in wet. But then there's something else, and there's this. There are those degrees of wetness that we can work with in watercolor that makes wonderful things happen. So I'm going to do another area here. Wait a minute, before I do that, you can also blot the brush like this and take up excess water like I'm doing here. And there again we are controlling wetness. Now, I want to wet another area of the paper right here. Now we're going to let that dry. I'm going to show you what can happen with various degrees of wetness. So I'm going to have just a sort of a moderately loaded brush here, where I have the brush doesn't have very much water in it at all. It's designed to give me a dark color. Now, as this loses its gloss, now look at the difference between what's happening here and what happened up here. When it's just beginning to lose its gloss, it's going to spread just a little bit. And it's going to keep spreading until as the gloss goes away. In other words, as the water evaporates, that's going to continue to spread. Now, if I keep my eye on this wetness, and you can't see that on the camera, but if I keep my eye on that wetness and I wait for that gloss to go away, that would be called wet on damp. This, where the gloss is there, we can see it, and we put the paint in there, and the paint flows all over the place, or all within the wet area. We call that wet in wet. This is still wet in wet. But now that the gloss has gone away, I'm going to take the same degree of wetness in the brush and put another stroke right here, and now that's wet and damp. And as you begin to compare the edges, you'll see how the wet and wet gives you a much softer edge, but the texture at the edge here is a little bit more widespread. The wet and damp will give you the texture a little bit closer together. And of course, as that continues to dry, the textures begin to soften and do wonderful things. Then when the water completely disappears, you can take your hand and hit it like that. Just touch it with the back of your hand, and it will feel very cool. And when it feels very cool like that, that's another degree of wet in wet, in which you can get, or with which you can get softer edges. As the water evaporates from the paint, the edges will get less soft, and have different character to them. And so let's see what will happen right here. Now you can see the edge. It will still, when it's damp, where you can't see the dampness, but you can feel it with the back of your hand, your edge will still be somewhat soft. As it dries, it gets softer and softer. And then you can compare that to an area here. Let's put this right beside it right here. An area which is not damp, where you get the really hard edge. Yeah, you can see the difference. The really hard edge, wet on dry. The slightly softer edge, wet on damp. And a little bit wetter, you might say wet on damper, you get even the more ragged edge. And then wet, really on really wet, it's more like this, where you get no edge at all, where the water completely disappears. So you see, watercolor painting, and the reason I like to compare watercolor painting with pottery, the success of watercolor painting is to a great degree depending upon the water. Just as when you're working with clay, to a great degree, the success of how you control, or your ability to control the clay, is dependent upon the amount of water that's there. And so, there's your quick tip.